anyone else back there? No, okay. Okay, now last time I was talking about this very, very important construction that Nietzsche makes, which he thinks is the basic motor of moral development in the West, the basic motor. Not the only thing, of course, because he also believes that history is a kind of open process in which various things come in from the outside, accidental conjunctions take place, etc. So it's not the only motor, but it is one important motor, and it's been a particularly central and dominant motor. And that's the motor which gets started when, as he says, the priests reinterpret the suffering of the slaves. So there are two perspectives on this phenomenon. There's Nietzsche's perspective on this phenomenon, which says the slaves are in fact suffering, the suffering is real, and the reason they're suffering is they're weak. That's the reality of the situation as Nietzsche sees it. However, if you're suffering because you're weak, and you can give no meaning to that suffering, the suffering becomes intolerable. So the priests provide the slaves with something that is useful to them. They provide the priests with an interpretation of the suffering that they have. You remember he says in various places, there are no moral phenomena, there are just moral interpretations of phenomena. So a morality is inherently a certain kind of way of living, but it's a way of living with a particular interpretation. And without the interpretation, it isn't a morality, it might be something else. So the priests turn the suffering of the slaves into a morality. They give it sense, they give it meaning. They explain where it comes from, and more importantly, they explain what the slaves can do about it. So they give the slaves a goal, right? You remember Nietzsche's constantly talking about the question of whether we have a goal or we don't have a goal. Do we have a goal? Do we not have a goal? One of the things he thinks is a problem in European society in the late 19th century is that there is no goal. So do you have a goal? Does your world make sense to you? That is there something that you can do, that you know you can do, or do you not? And the priests say, look, there is something you can do. You're suffering. Look, that's a phenomenon I take seriously. And you're suffering not because you're weak. You're suffering because you've sinned. That is, they have the concept of evil from the first essay, and the concept of evil is connected with the concept, you remember, of being like the masters. The evil are the people who are like the masters. Now, what's the main characteristic of the masters? The main characteristic of the masters, he says, is immediacy of action. The masters, Achilles, just acts on his spontaneous impulses. He doesn't reflect, he doesn't think about things. As I said, this is a mythic caricature of any human form of life, but this is the form of the caricature. So what's wrong with the masters is they're willful and immediate. They do what they want and they get pleasure out of doing what they want. So if that is evil, and if the suffering of the slaves is a suffering which they endure because they are like the masters, they are sinful, then there's a clear meaning to that suffering. The suffering is not freestanding. The suffering that they have is not just something that comes from nowhere, and it's not something they can't do anything about. It's suffering that is connected with their action. Namely, it's a result of the fact that they have sinned, they have been like the masters, they have exerted their wills. So it's connected its origin is connected with a kind of action, and there's a therapy for it. Namely, the therapy is to act so as to become a non-sinner. That is, if you're suffering because you've acted aggressively, immediately, spontaneously, then you can get rid of the suffering by acting so as to undermine your tendency to become aggressive, spontaneous, and like the masters. So, as Nietzsche says, with this, the sick person is turned into a sinner, namely a person who sees his own suffering or her own suffering as the result of having been too much like the masters, having acted too aggressively and too willfully, and sees that phenomenon, that is the phenomenon of having acted willfully, as a problem and something that can be worked on. That's something that can be worked on. And now this, as Nietzsche says, also slots in to the thing that he talks about in the second essay, when he talks about the natural tendency of the human being to turn their aggression against themselves. So I see myself suffering, and I interpret my suffering as resulting from my willfulness, and I have a desire to punish myself. And so what I do is I have a project then of causing myself more suffering. That is, I have a project of punishing myself for my sin. That is, I have the project of not just not doing various things, but of breaking my own will, of turning my will against itself, of making it be the case that every time I find impulses of willfulness in myself, which are impulses that are like the impulses that I saw in the master and I described as evil, every time I see such an impulse, I try to extirpate it. I try to turn my aggression against myself. And then Nietzsche says, and you can see why, this is a kind of stable system. Of course, as I said, Nietzsche is not Hegel, so he doesn't think that logically stable systems are the only thing. He doesn't think that, as it were, they're freestanding. But this is a relatively stable system. And notice, Nietzsche says, it's not just a stable system in that it keeps in a steady state. It's a stable system that develops in a particular way. Namely, I'm suffering. I interpret my suffering as sin, as willfulness. I turn my aggression against myself. I turn my aggression against my willful impulses. And now Nietzsche says, but what is going to happen to you if you turn your own will against itself? What's going to happen to you if you turn your impulse to aggression against all of your own aggressive tendencies? What's going to happen is that you're going to become even more paralyzed and even weaker than you were to begin with. So this establishes a continual process of self-torment. You're suffering because you're weak. You interpret that weakness as the result of sin. You turn your impulses against yourself, and by turning your impulses against yourself, you make yourself even weaker. Because what does it mean to be weak? What does it mean to turn your aggression against yourself? Turning your aggression against yourself, this is at least Nietzsche's thesis, part of what this means is you're going to get even weaker. Every time you've got a healthy impulse, you're not going to act on it. Every time you have a healthy impulse, you're going to turn your will against it. And so you're going to become weaker, more inhibited, etc. But if Nietzsche's right that the source of suffering is weakness, the source of suffering is not sin, then every time you deal with the sin by getting control of your impulses, by getting control of your aggressive impulses and turning your aggression against itself, every time you do that, you're going to become even weaker than you were before. But of course, if you're even weaker than you were before, you're going to be suffering more than you were before, because the hypothesis is that suffering comes from weakness. And then the whole thing can repeat itself. Then you're even more suffering, you feel even more sin, you turn your aggression even against itself more. So this classic kind of Christian spiral, as you know, in the Christian literature, there's often been this observation that the people who think they're most sinful are the people who are least sinful, because you start reflecting on sinfulness, and the more you look for it, the more you're going to find, right? I mean, if you're happy-go-lucky and you go through life as Achilles does, you're not going to have much problem. But once you begin down the road, it ends with Dostoevsky. So this is the project. So Nietzsche says this. So you can see this spiral as generating both on the one hand, Western morality, that is a greater and greater form of introspection, a greater and greater form of the turning of aggression against itself, and also greater and greater suffering and greater debilitation, a greater and greater weakening of human powers. So this is the mechanism that he thinks is the central mechanism operating in Christianity. Now, he says about this has certain advantages, but it's got disadvantages too. And now the advantages are, as he says, that at least in the short run, and of course he's thinking about the short run as hundreds of years, right? I mean, he's trying to tell a history of 2,000 or 3,000 years of Western culture. So the short run can be a couple of hundred years. So in the short run, he says, this really does do something for the slaves. It does do something for them because, remember, they're going to suffer no matter what. There's nothing they can do about that. The assumption of the argument is there's nothing they can do about that. There's no medicine to cure you from being weak. There's no medicine. There's no actual change. This is a theory which isn't connected with sort of Enlightenment views about life getting better by virtue of technological progress. It isn't that the weak and ill slaves, it isn't that Asclepius, the god of healing, is going to come down and actually have a medicine for them. There's nothing you can do about it. You're on earth, there's nothing you can do about it. You're suffering, there's nothing you can do about it. The only thing you can do about it is see whether that suffering is meaningless or meaningful. And so meaningful a suffering that has sense is easier to tolerate than a suffering that has no sense. So if it really is the case that you can't actually change the phenomenon, if it really is the case that you can't change the suffering of people, all you can do is make them see it to be have sense or not have sense. If you look at it in the short term, this looks like a good deal because my alternatives are suffering and seeing it has no point, and suffering and having at least some sense to that suffering and some sense of what I can do. So in the short run, he says, this is a good deal for the slaves because at any given time, their alternative is suffer for nothing or suffer and try to do something about it. And there it's better to have a suffering that makes some kind of sense than suffering that has no sense in the short run. So you can see why they're pulled into this project in the short run. Second, he thinks that given that we do have a genuine need to torture someone, it's better to torture ourselves than not to be able to torture anybody at all. So we get a certain kind of pleasure from that. Furthermore, he thinks that this process of increasing self-torment swamps our lives with other emotions. We're flooded with emotions, and remember that for him, suffering is generally connected with lack of affect. His model, what he thinks is the problem in the 19th century is that people are too apathetic. The problem that he worries about is, it's decadence that's the source of his worry, or what he calls nihilism. That is, he doesn't worry that people in the 19th century, that in different historical epochs, people have different fears. In some epochs, people fear that everyone is too out of control. And so we have Hobbes. You worry that everybody's too out of control. And so if that's your worry, you try to find a state that will control it. But in the 19th century, Nietzsche's fear is not that everybody's out of control. Nietzsche's fear is nobody wants to do anything. We're apathetic. We've lost any sense of anything. We're lying in this pool, this puddle of apathy and suffering, and no one can get themselves organized to do anything. We've lost then the sense that anything is worth doing. So note, if that's the thing you're worried about, then even being in this sadomasochistic cycle is better than that because it swamps you with various sorts of feelings. And having some feeling is better than not having any feeling at all. That's why you remember he says at the end, people would rather will nothingness than not will anything at all. So at least it satisfies that need, and that's a a general thing. However, so that's the advantage. And that's an advantage in the short run. However, in the long run, of course, he says, one, it doesn't cure the problem. It tries to treat a symptom of the problem. It doesn't cure the problem. The real problem is the weakness of these people. That's what's the real cause of the thing. That is not cured by this. In fact, it's made worse by this. So although in the short run it gives you this jolt of energy, in the long run it has the disadvantage that it doesn't deal with the problem. And it doesn't only not deal with the problem, it makes the problem worse. Now, of course, in the case of Christianity, he thinks there's a further thing that's a problem here, which is he thinks not just that Christianity has this, if you think of this mechanism as the central mechanism of Christianity, this mechanism doesn't just make the problem worse. He thinks that the operation of the mechanism will dissolve itself and will undermine itself and dissolve itself if it's allowed to run uncontrolled. Because, he thinks, one of the characteristics, Christianity has two characteristics, he thinks, and these two characteristics are central to it, but the more you cultivate them, the more the Christian project is going to become implausible. So the more Christianity operates, the more it's going to generate these two things, but the more it generates these two things, the more it's going to be impossible not to see and to continue to believe in the mechanism. And these two attributes are introspection and truth-telling, right? So he says Christianity, as part of its process, generates in people an extreme form of introspection. That's part of what Christianity does. Remember his focus on the Sermon on the Mount, right? The Sermon on the Mount says, Jesus says, they told you of old, don't kill people. I say, don't even be angry. So for Christianity, if Christianity has the property that he says it has, part of what makes it go is that it turns our attention. It doesn't just turn our aggression against from being directed toward others to being directed toward ourselves. It turns our attention to ourselves. That is, if Christianity says what's wrong is your internal mental or psychological impulses, if that's what's wrong, if what's wrong is not that you kill people, but that you have impulses of anger, then it's natural to think that there'll be a shift from the study of murder, the study of social structures, to the study of human psychology. So you have Plato, who talks about the polis, the city-state. You have Augustine, who talks about his soul and the relation of his soul to God. So this process of introspection, he thinks, gets more and more developed with Christianity. You have, as the spiral process continues, people become more and more directed at looking into themselves and seeing what their sheerest and smallest velleities are. What are the minimal impulses they have? So that's one thing, he says, that gets bigger with Christianity. From the Greeks to the 18th century, people become more introspective. And that's not an accident. That's part of the Christianity teaches you to do that, right? You think of Foucault, right, and his discussion of the confession and the confession in the 19th century, in the Middle Ages, and the way in which confessions get established as a central part of religiosity. The second thing that becomes that's very important for Christianity, of course, is truth-telling, right? As you know, one of the real things that Nietzsche thinks is important in his own work is that he does not start from the Christian assumption that truth has a self-evident value and that truth-telling has a self-evident value. Now, remember, for example, Nietzsche is a classical scholar, and so he will remember, for example, in the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, you remember, the hero of the Odyssey is Odysseus, and Odysseus is admirable precisely because he's such a good liar, right? You remember, so it's far from the case that lying is automatically bad, right? In Christianity, it's let your speech be yea, yea, and nay, nay, and never lie, never lie, never lie. That's not a universal sentiment. You remember Odysseus's big patron is the goddess Athena. Now, the goddess Athena is the goddess of wisdom, right? And you remember Athena brings Odysseus back to Ithaca, and he wakes up, and she appears to him in the form of a man, and she says, "Who are you?" And he tells her this lying story, right? So his goddess, his patron goddess, has taken him back home, left him on the beach. She appears to him. She says, "Who are you?" He says, "Oh, I don't remember what story he makes up. He makes up I'm a Cretan. I was a merchant." And blah, blah, blah. And Athena says to him, "I'm the goddess Athena. That's really why I love you. You're the best liar I've ever seen. If I weren't even a goddess, you'd take even me in." And you remember, Odysseus' grandfather is called Autolycus, the lone wolf. And he's said to be the greatest man around in stealing sheep and lying, right? So in this society, there's no taboo on lying. Lying isn't, as it were, it isn't kind of automatically clear that lying is a bad thing. Lying is a skill like other skills, and you can do it better or you can do it worse, and you can do it in a context in which it's useful, or you can do it in a context in which it's not useful. So Nietzsche is very focused on these archaic Greek models and thinks that truth-telling, so remember, he says, one of the ways of thinking about my work is that I'm giving a genealogy of the will to truth. I'm giving a historical account of how it ever comes about that people want to know the truth. How does it come about? It isn't obvious, right? I mean, Aristotle says at the beginning of the Metaphysics, all men desire to know, right? And you might think that that means all men desire to pursue the truth. But Nietzsche says, no, that's a particular project Aristotle has. It isn't the case that all men desire to know. It isn't the case that all men want the truth. The will to truth has the same status as the will to pizza. No one is born with the will to pizza. You have to. There's a particular time in Naples when the will to pizza gets established, and it's a wonderful thing, of course. And where would we be without it? But as it were, you don't have. You were not born, you wouldn't start a metaphysical treatise by saying, Aristotle says, pantes anthropoi oregontai phusei to Adenai, all men by nature want to know. You wouldn't say all men by nature want to make good pizza. I mean, it's true. Now note, it might be true that once you have the pizza, anyone would like it. But that's a different question, right? It's one thing whether once you have the pizza, everyone will like it, or whether everyone has a natural will to develop the capacity to produce pizza, okay? So the will to truth is a really important part of this. And now you remember, Nietzsche says, but the will to truthfulness, that is the will to telling the truth, is a deeply seated moral demand of Christianity. That is, one of the ways in which the slaves distinguish themselves from the masters is precisely that the masters are like Odysseus. They have a rather pragmatic attitude toward truth-telling. You tell the truth to the people who are your equals. Whether you tell the truth to the plebs or not is completely irrelevant. And if you're Odysseus, you make an art of lying in order to get your way. And so there's a pragmatic relation to that. It's the slaves who say there must be an absolute prohibition on truth, on telling lies. So Nietzsche says, of course, this moral demand gives rise to an absolute prohibition on telling lies, and the absolute prohibition on telling lies then gives rise to an absolute prohibition on telling lies even to yourself. So remember, it's the other way around than you might think, right? So again, Nietzsche thinks that the actual succession is the reverse of the succession that we would think. The natural succession, if you start sort of from Aristotle, is I want to know the truth. I want to tell myself the truth. Therefore, I want to tell you the truth. Therefore, there's a moral demand that everyone tell the truth. That's the succession. But Nietzsche says the real succession is exactly the reverse of that. The real succession is the beginning. We are the weak slaves. We have it as a moral demand that everyone tell the truth. You must tell me the truth. Then that truth-telling gets established as an absolute demand and gets associated with introspection. So I don't just want to, so to tell the truth to you, I don't just want to tell the truth to you, I want to tell the truth to myself. But how can I tell the truth to myself? I can only tell the truth to myself if I know the truth. So I develop a will to truth, which is derivative from this underlying moral imperative not to lie to other people. So wanting to know the truth, the very concept of the truth, he thinks, is a construct that arises from a basic moral demand. So it isn't the case that I first want to know the truth and then I get an ethics from that. It's that I've got an ethics of truth-telling, and then I have to have a will to truth because I have to know what the truth is to tell it. I can't tell the truth unless I know what it is. So that's the order in which this happens. But now Nietzsche says, but look, suppose you grant me that. Suppose it's the case that as Christianity rumbles on, right, each generation screwing the screw a little more tightly, each generation going a little bit further down the thing. As that happens, people will become more and more introspective. They'll think about their own motives more and more. And they'll want to know the truth about their motives. And they'll want to tell the truth about their motives. And now Nietzsche says, if this goes on long enough, they're going to find out what's going on. They won't be able to deceive themselves, right? This whole game, Nietzsche says, is a huge deception, right? Namely, it's a deception that's based on a lie. It's based on the lie that you're suffering not because you're weak, but you're suffering because you're sinful. That's a lie. Now, you might say, lie schmai, why don't I act like Odysseus? But if you're a Christian, you can't take that view, because if you're involved in this process of self-flagellating slavery, one of the things you'll want is you won't want to tell yourself lies. And you'll be trained to pick up all the signs of internal velleities of one sort or another. So the more you go on, the more Christians will become aware of what they're doing to themselves in this, the more that they'll be, so in other words, the birth of tragedy, the genealogy of morality is the last step in the process in which Christianity dissolves itself. Christianity gets started with this slave morality. It generates a desire for truth. It generates introspection. Nietzsche, as you know, describes himself always as the great psychologist. It goes through these things. So Christians become more and more keen at analyzing themselves and telling the truth about it. And the last one who analyzes this and tells the truth about it is Nietzsche. And what he sees is that the whole process is a fraud. So that's why his work is, as it were, he would say, is the kind of both the culmination of this Christian process that starts, but it's a culmination in which the culmination undermines the whole thing. So that's one of the reasons why but now notice too what happens. Now you're in a completely paradoxical situation, right? Because if you have the will to truth, you can see that the will to truth comes from a will to lie. Comes from a lie, right? Because the will to truth itself is a product of Christianity. But Christianity is a product of telling yourself that you're not suffering because you're weak, but because so that's why that's one of the reasons why Nietzsche's works never stop anywhere. They're in a continual process because they're going through the process of developing further the will to truth. He keeps saying, I want to know what the truth is. I want to know reality. I don't want to know fairy tales. And yet, knowing that that very will to truth has its roots in something which is not. So it's the opposite of right? Hegel thought if you discuss things dialectically, the dialectical process wouldn't be like Plato. It wouldn't break off in aporia. The dialectical process would mean you'd get all the categories that you had, and you'd move through all these categories, and it would come back, and it would be a big circle. It would be a self-grounding circle. So Hegel thought, you start you say to me, I say to you, what is tohosion, piety, and we start discussing that, and then we move from that, and we move, and the discussion keeps going on. And now Hegel thinks if you keep the discussion going on, and you really discuss it seriously, and you're in the right historical circumstances, you'll go through all the possible categories that you have, and you'll come back to the original category again. And you'll see the whole thing. There won't be anything outside the process, but the process will be self-grounding. That's what I'm trying to say. The process of discussion won't, in Plato, the process of discussion just stops because they don't get any further, because the people walk away from him. Or they walk away from him, or they fall asleep in the symposium, right? They all fall asleep. He's the only one who's left with Agathon and Aristophanes, at the end, and there are only three. Everybody else is asleep, So the dialectic never really goes anywhere. So now one possibility is if you keep the dialectic going, it just stops at some point. Or my other favorite example is from Büchner, from Danton's Tod, right? Camille and Danton are talking about art. I think I've used this example before. They're talking about art, and Büchner says, a discussion about art can go on forever, wenn nichts dazwischen tritt, if nothing comes in from the outside and interrupts it. This time something did, namely, Robespierre has them comes into the discussion, has them arrested and decapitated, and that ends the discussion, right? So the discussion of art could go on forever if reality didn't bite. So one possibility is reality just bites. So one possibility is no matter how long you discuss it, there'll be no convergence, as they say. It'll just go on. Another thing is you'll discuss it for long enough, and then reality will come in and bite you. Robespierre will take power and send Danton to the guillotine. Hegel thinks, no, if you can really do it consistently, it will be self-grounding, right? You'll get a full system, and the system will be completely consistent and complete, and the question of a foundation for that outside won't arise. Nietzsche thinks the process won't be self-grounding, it will be self-dissolving. The more you pursue truth through the will to truth and introspection, the more you pursue that, the more you will come to see that that very project is rooted in something which is incompatible with maintaining it as an absolute value. Because the more you'll see that the search for truth is itself based on a fundamental invention, namely that I'm not suffering because I'm weak, but I'm suffering because I've sinned. Okay, so that means that your philosophical arguments are always going to be unsettled. You're always going to be, with Hegel, there's a big circle, but the circle stands by itself. With Plato, it stands somewhere in history. With Nietzsche, you just keep going. You can just keep going, and you can go around the rabbit cage, the squirrel's cage, any number of times, but you keep going around. You don't get anywhere else out of it. Okay, so that's what Nietzsche says when he says that the problem of the late 19th century is nihilism. That is, that description is a description of a state in which the highest values which we have devalue themselves. So now, okay, let me say a little bit about nihilism. There are some sporadic occurrences of the term nihilism before I used to say that nihilism was invented by a man named Jacobi in 1799, right? I used to say that. And then, it's really one of the wonderful things in my life. a student in the audience at one time pointed out to me that there's a French encyclopedia in the 18th century which has an entry for nihilismus. So Jacobi did not invent the term nihilism, as you often hear. There's some French, I actually never got the reference, but I would believe it. So there are sporadic uses of the term nihilism before Jacobi, but the real start of the topic is this book that he publishes in 1799. He's an opponent of Kant, and he says he uses the term nihilism to describe the Kantian philosophy. He says the Kantian philosophy is deeply nihilistic. And he says, I mean deeply nihilistic because the Kantian philosophy says the thing in itself is unknowable. Therefore, he says that the world we see is a mere Erscheinung, it's a mere appearance, it has no substance, it's not a thing in itself. So he is a nihilist. He also calls Kant in this famous phrase, der alles zermalmo, the guy who chops everything, who grinds everything. Kant is the universal grinder up. Anyway, now, nihilism gets used in the 19th century. Now, it's really important to see whether a term is used as a term of self-description or a term of other description, right? Remember Nietzsche's discussion about the masters and the slaves. What the masters call good, the slaves call evil. What the masters call bad, the slaves call good. So it depends really who's... Nihilism is a term that's almost, until the middle of the 19th century, is almost always used by opponents of people. So the structure is, I am okay, you are a nihilist. So to say you're a nihilist means literally it means you believe in nothing. But actually nobody believes in nothing. Nobody believes in nothing. I mean, to believe in nothing is just impossible. So to say you're a nihilist, you believe in nothing, really means I have something I think is really important, you don't accept it. So for Jacobi thought traditional forms of religious belief and belief in the existence of the external world, they're values in themselves. So since you, Kant, don't believe in that, you must be a nihilist. Now, the fact that Kant didn't believe in those things, but it didn't mean he believed in nothing. He had different beliefs, right? And again, if you look at even the anarchist groups, the Russian groups in the 19th century, they called themselves sometimes nihilists, but they didn't actually believe in nothing. What they generally believed in, they didn't believe in the established values of society, but they believed in something else. You remember in Fathers and Sons, what's the guy's name? Bezhukov. Sorry, I forget what his name is. The nihilist son says his father plays the cello, you remember. And he says, oh, how horrible it is to play the cello. Romantic garbage, playing the cello. It's so soulful to make you sick. He believes, however, in science, right? So you have to be careful with the term nihilism, because nihilism is one of these philosophical bugbears, like relativism. Nobody's a relativist. That's an invention of philosophers who want to make some jobs for themselves to do. Nobody's a nihilist in the sense of actually not believing in anything. It's just they believe in some deviant things. Now Nietzsche has a clear line on nihilism. He says not nihilism means believing in nothing. What he says is nihilism means that the bisherigen, dass die bisherigen höchsten Werte, that the values which up to that time had been the highest values come to be devalued. So die bisherigen höchsten Werte entwerten sich. So it isn't that you believe in nothing, it's that there's an established set of values, Christian values, he thinks, and those established values lose their value. That doesn't mean that there are no values. It just means that that particular set of values, which were until then the highest value, have lost their value. They're the things that hold things together. So he says, we're now in a situation of nihilism, but we're in a situation of nihilism which is, as it were, a double nihilism. And it's important to see that he thinks that the situation in the 19th century is a situation of double nihilism. Namely, the values that have up to now been the most highly regarded values are Christian values. Okay? Now, in one sense, he thinks, in one sense, Christian values are nihilistic values, because Christian values are values that do not value the real things in the world that give us pleasure. They deny the value of those things in the world that give us pleasure. That's what Christianity, he thinks, is all about. Christianity is about, after all, ascetic. Oh, sorry, I should interrupt myself. Another way, of course, of describing that circle, that spiral that I described, is to say it's the genesis of an ascetic ideal. That instead of ascetic practices, you can see the genesis of an ascetic ideal, because it's the genesis of the view, not just that you shouldn't do what you want to do in this context because there's something else you want to do, but genesis of the view that you should, in general, not do what you want. It's good for you not to do what you want. It's good for you to turn your will against yourself. So the spiral of Christianity is a spiral of further and further fixation on the ascetic ideal. Now, so the Christian values in themselves, Nietzsche says, are nihilistic, because what's really valuable in the world, he thinks this is the truth, is what we actually take immediate pleasure in, what we actually, ways in which we can actually assert ourselves, what he calls immediate expressions of the will to power. That's what's really valuable in the world: eating, drinking, doing various sorts of things. Christianity is a form of nihilism because it denies those values, right? The real values are the values of the body and the values of pleasure. The real world is the world around us. The world around us is what's real. The pleasures of the body are what's real. That's what he talks about in Ecce Homo. When he talks about himself, he talks about the kind of food he likes. He talks about the kind of climate he likes. They're the things that are real. And Christianity is a form of nihilism because it denies the value of that. It says this world is not real. The world beyond is real. The pleasures of the body are not real pleasures. The real pleasures are spiritual pleasures, etc. So Christian values in themselves are forms of nihilism. But what happens when these values, which are themselves forms of nihilism, themselves lose their value? That is, we're living, he thinks, in an era of a kind of second-order nihilism. We had, from the ancient world to the 19th century, a set of values. They had problems. They were nihilistic. They denied the pleasures of the flesh. They denied the existence of the final existence of the real world. They caused us to repress ourselves. They were nihilistic in that sense, but they gave our life some kind of meaning. There was some kind of structure. You wanted to know what to do in the 16th century, you asked the Pope, or you asked Calvin, or you did something. Gave you some kind of meaning. Now, he says, we're in a situation in which, as it were, the only ideals we have a grasp on at all are nihilistic ideals, these Christian ideals. But yet those ideals are no longer firmly in the saddle. We're even losing a sense of them. They're losing their grip. So all that's given life meaning and structure is this denial of this world. That's a nihilistic claim. But that denial of this world is itself losing its plausibility because it's connected with all the things that he analyzes. So he thinks we're in a situation in which there's a kind of double nihilism. Christianity has now reached a stage in which it's dissolving itself, and it's losing, and even these highest values are losing their meaning. Now, you remember, at this point, he introduces yet another sense of conscience. Do you remember last time and the time before I talked about the different senses in which he uses the term conscience? He talks about the good conscience of the future, you remember. He talks about bad conscience that was interiorized, bad conscience that was moralized, the active bad conscience, which generates newer and newer forms of setting the moral bar higher for us. At this point, he introduces another variety of conscience, which he calls the intellectual conscience, right? Now, so he says, we are ourselves in a situation in which we, as the result of this training that we've had for centuries in looking at ourselves, introspection, and telling the truth, we have developed a certain association of ideas connected with the departure from introspection and telling the truth. That is, if I actually fail to tell the truth that I know, my intellectual conscience will not allow me to do that. I will associate that with pain. And similarly, if I don't sufficiently introspect, my intellectual conscience will fill me with pain. Now note, that's a different sense of conscience than all of these other senses of conscience. And now I think it's important to see that this kind of plurality is not an accident for Nietzsche. This is part of Nietzsche's general approach to the world. Remember, Nietzsche does not think that we should look at the world, certainly we should look at the human world, and we should see the human world as, in the Platonic way, as instantiating well-defined instances of things, right? So it isn't, he would say, so if you ask me, what do all those things have in common? What does the good conscience, which he describes at the beginning of Essay 2, the bad conscience, which he describes in the past, the active bad conscience, which he describes as a mechanism for generating new ideals, and this thing which he calls das intellektuelle Gewissen, the intellectual conscience, what do they all have in common? The answer to that will not be a definition. And that's because, of course, he thinks that approaching the human world through definitions is the wrong way to do it. So it's a deeply anti-Platonic project. You remember he says in section 2, only that which has no history can be defined. So if you think of any human phenomenon, that human phenomenon is going to be a historical phenomenon. So it will be something like Christianity or conscience or the system of punishment. Anything that has a history will be the kind of thing about which one can't give a definition in the Platonic sense. That is, one won't be able to give necessary and sufficient conditions for something being that. So so you can't give a definition of Christianity. What kind of definition can you give of Christianity? Christianity has to be understood as a historical structure of a different kind, in which certain things are central at some times, other things are central at the other times. Similarly, the concept of conscience, there isn't, as it were, a single definition, a single abstract definition of things that are instances of conscience and things that are not instances of conscience. All there are is, he sometimes describes his project as one of giving a natural history of morality. And to give a natural history of morality means you don't, as it were, start trying to define what conscience is. You start by looking at the varieties of things there are out there. So you look out there and you see there's this, there's this, there's this. They are connected in various ways. We can call them all conscience in reason. We can call them conscience, but we don't call them conscience by virtue of them all having some set of properties which characterize all of them and don't characterize others of them. They have a more historically contextual kind of existence, and the right way to understand them is by looking at them in their ecological niche. If you do natural history in the 19th century, as you know, is this enterprise in which you look at the different kinds of fauna and flora that you have in their relevant contexts. So similarly, too, you don't look for a definition of conscience. You look for the varieties of things that can be called conscience, and you look at them in their relevant historical context, and you try to understand them by seeing how they're related to each other. Okay, so that's basically what I want to talk about today. I think I'll stop there actually, because I don't want to start the next topic, which is truth. So next time I'll talk about truth and related things. So I'll see those of you the next time who turn up the next time.